Welcome back. It's Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller. Although for tonight's episode, I will be channeling the spirit of the late, great Peter Thomas, best known as the narrator extraordinaire of Basic Cable's most potent sleep aid, one that even predates Dateline. The 22-minute-long true crime procedural that was every late-night insomniac's best friend. Forensic Files. And if you are new to Forensic Files or would like to know more about how Forensic Files became this strange sleep aid for many of us in the 90s and 2000s, check out an earlier episode called A Bitter Pill. Now, it's been a while since we've done a Forensic Flashback, and I was inspired to create a new one for this week as a final postscript on my recent visit to CrimeCon. While meandering through the vast halls of a convention center just outside of Denver, Colorado, I crossed paths with two people who worked for a distribution company called FilmRise. FilmRise is a logo many of us recognize. It's the one that bubbles up just before a lot of our true crime classics. But just to bore you a little bit as we settle in for the night, FilmRise started as a British production company, and I remember first seeing that logo while watching the late 90s British detective series with a pre-Hollywood Clive Owen. It was called Second Sight. Then FilmRise changed hands and became an American distribution company that now specializes in distributing overlooked vintage TV classics. And in around 2012 or so, their first big acquisition was buying the rights to the vast Forensic Files catalog from the 90s when it began to 2011 when the original Forensic Files ended. A total of 400 episodes. And thank goodness, because they've made the entire catalog of Forensic Files available to everyone through YouTube. Because those who know Forensic Files, you understand that what makes it a sleepy nighttime series, it certainly isn't the violence. There isn't much in Forensic Files. It's the density of the material and the detailed explanation about how they used advanced forensic techniques to crack a case. And there were certain phrases that were like, linguistic Ambien. Who could stay awake when Peter Thomas noted how a particular case was solved using everyone's favorite technology, gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. And that's why Peter Thomas is the master. And after chatting briefly with that FilmRise team, where we shared this weird fascination with falling asleep to Forensic Files, I was inspired to revisit a favorite episode of mine, a truly disturbing stalking incident that happened to a teacher in a small Pennsylvania town in the mid-1990s. And maybe like you, my favorite Forensic Files episodes are the ones where the victim, fortunately, is still with us and speaks to Forensic Files on camera. Though in this story, things and people are never quite what they seem. A very special thank you to Dead Sleep's unofficial house band, Robots in the Sun, for the original score in tonight's episode, inspired by Forensic Files. Oh, and before I forget, Dead Sleep is always independent and ad-free, and I think we all like it that way. So please help me continue making this podcast by becoming a paid subscriber through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Patreon. And so with that, let's settle in for the night and get ready for the Dead Sleep version of a Forensic Files episode from Season 2, titled Sealed with a Kiss. doesn't matter how old you are or where you're from. Everybody has that teacher. The one you remember from your childhood. The one who stood out. The one who made a difference. The kind of teacher whose name you'll never forget. JoAnne Chambers was one of those teachers, a favorite among students and parents alike, ever since she joined the Pocono Mountain School District in rural Pennsylvania to teach first grade. JoAnne's specialty was helping kids that age, around 6 and 7 years old, learn how to read. JoAnne was known for her patience, her kindness, and her positive energy that radiated throughout the halls of their small school, located in a small township called Coolbaugh. Roughly a 2-hour drive, but a world away from New York City. JoAnne was a veteran educator. In her 40s, JoAnne sometimes appeared like a kid herself, wearing a Mickey Mouse t-shirt and jeans to class. JoAnne's voice was soft, but her emotions ran strong. She desired a deep connection with her young students, ending each class with the words, "You are wonderful and beautiful. You make my heart happy." She wore her blonde hair in a bobbed style, with fringy bangs that highlighted her enormous bluish-green eyes. Her eyes seemed to express her every emotion in the moment. And right around the start of the school year in 1993, her big, expressive eyes were wide in shock. The school principal told JoAnne he'd received a troubling, typewritten letter. The letter wanted the school principal to know that JoAnne Chambers had brought pot to school, and she showed it in the faculty room like it was a big joke. And this letter would have been funny, except the potential consequences for JoAnne were dead serious. She taught children. There was obviously a zero-tolerance policy around drug use as an educator. JoAnne had come to the district after years teaching in Lackawanna County, a larger area about 30 minutes away, where the big city there was Scranton. Then maybe city teachers in Scranton could puff Maui Wowie and brag about it, but not here, in this small country town. Obviously, JoAnne denied anything about pot, and the school principal, of course, believed her. She had an excellent reputation, so she needn't worry about losing her job. But what should be the cause for concern was this letter, and who had written it. Because it appeared, despite popular opinion, not everyone loved JoAnne Chambers. Evidently, there was at least one person who was most decidedly not a fan of JoAnne. When JoAnne learned about this letter, she remained calm and collected. Ever the professional, her suggestion on next steps was like something she might teach her own students. Let's find out who this was so they could sit down and work this out. There had to be some misunderstanding, and JoAnne, she was eager to fix it, especially if it was some angry parent who had somehow gotten hold of some bad information. And hopefully they'd soon come forward and JoAnne could assure them that this whole drug thing, it was just a ridiculous rumor. This letter, of course, had no return address, and at the time there was no clear indicator of who it could be. So it was a game of wait and see. JoAnne wouldn't have to wait long, because another letter soon arrived. This one addressed directly to JoAnne Chambers. And the tone of this letter was more hostile than the previous one to her boss. The tone of this was threatening. The letter read in part, "I can get you In one try. No one will ever prove it. They may not think so, but I'm smarter than all of you." Then the letter insulted JoAnne, calling her a stupid bee. Though they didn't write just bee, they wrote the full word, the full swear. It was the kind of language that a first-grade school teacher was not accustomed to. But JoAnne was more than offended. She was becoming afraid. Most disconcerting was that she had no idea who could be behind it, nor did her bosses, including the school superintendent, who was at a loss. JoAnne Chambers was a happily married woman with a 10-year-old son, no known enemies, and lauded for her work with kids, especially kids with special needs. Everyone spoke highly of JoAnne's teaching abilities, and she was respected by teachers inside the school and all over the district. There was absolutely no reason for anyone to target JoAnne for some hate campaign. She was perfect. Unless, could it be that someone thought JoAnne was too perfect, too good, too respected, and was on a vicious stalking campaign to bring her down? Make no mistake, teaching first grade wasn't just juice boxes and building blocks. Scoring a coveted spot, a good job in a good district, it could be competitive and cutthroat. Maybe it was someone from her past, someone from another school who resented JoAnne and how she was succeeding in her career. It was one theory, at least one possible motive. One as old as time. Jealousy. Soon, another letter. This one goading the school principal to check JoAnne's desk. "You'll find JoAnne seems to like Jack Daniels," the letter said. "That's the real teacher you like so much." And when JoAnne's desk was opened, there it was, a bottle of whiskey, Jack Daniels. JoAnne also noticed there were items missing, personal things that brought JoAnne joy, like a picture of herself with her 10-year-old son. This couldn't be someone from her past. They had access to JoAnne's classroom, which suggested it was someone inside the school. Either a school teacher or another school employee who knew JoAnne's schedule and also knew the day-to-day happenings at that particular elementary school. A person that if they were roaming the halls and poking their nose in various classrooms, no one would suspect anything. And with each day, this stalker appeared to grow more confident and more twisted. Their behavior escalating. One seemingly ordinary morning, as JoAnne settled into her classroom, situating herself at her desk, smoothing out the back of her dress, and as she sat back down again, she made a sickening discovery. Something was on her hand, and the seat of the chair, and on the back of her skirt. What was this? Oh no, it couldn't be. But it was. Someone had come into her classroom and put human fecal matter on her chair. And now it was smeared everywhere. How had this happened? Now, JoAnne, she taught the first grade, children aged 6 or 7. She was likely familiar that young children still had accidents now and again, but this was different. It was depraved, and it was intentional. And it appeared to be achieving its intended goal. JoAnne was horrified and traumatized. In an interview with Forensic Files, JoAnne recounted how she felt sick to her stomach. This wasn't happening, she thought to herself. This couldn't be happening. By now, the authorities were involved, and they were quite confident that there was someone inside this school who had it out for JoAnne. And the only way they'd be able to figure out who it was by installing a hidden camera in JoAnne's classroom to see if they could find the culprit, this deviant stalker, this poop dropper, in the act. And they couldn't install that camera soon enough because the photo, the one taken from her desk, the one with JoAnne and her young son, it resurfaced. Only now, this stalker had cut out JoAnne's face from that photo, pasted on top of a sexually suggestive photo of a nude woman, made Xerox copies, and had distributed them all over the school property, even taped some to the front of a local store. This was a small town, just 14,000 people. Everybody knew everybody. Who could do this and not get caught? Then came the phone calls to parents of JoAnne's students. And in these phone calls, a gruff voice hissed that JoAnne Chambers was a child abuser and she had AIDS. This was the 1990s, so accusing someone of having AIDS was a colossal insult and was a stain on someone's moral character. And this person didn't just have a grudge against JoAnne. This person seemed to harbor resentment towards the higher-ups, including the school superintendent. In one letter, the stalker referred to him disparagingly as Colonel Clink. Colonel Clink. He was a character in an old TV show called Hogan's Heroes, a black and white sitcom about a group of American soldiers in a Nazi POW camp during World War II. Now, Hogan's Heroes was an old show. It aired from 1965 to 1971 on CBS, but it ran in reruns for decades. Colonel Clink was one of the show's more outlandish characters, a conceited yet clueless Nazi officer who was cowardly towards his superiors and outsmarted by his captives. The show was long over by the 1990s, but it just so happened a dark detail around that show was making headlines in 1994, right around the time of this school drama. It all tied back to a horrific murder that took place in June of 1978, when the star of Hogan's Heroes, an actor named Bob Crane, was found dead in his apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona, the apparent victim of a vicious and deadly attack. By that summer in '78, Bob Crane's career had cratered since his Hogan's Heroes heyday. And he was working, scraping by, doing dinner theater in Scottsdale, trying to find his way back to Hollywood. When he failed to show up to a meeting, a fellow actor went by his apartment and discovered Bob Crane, bludgeoned to death, an electrical cord wrapped around his neck. At the time, there was a person of interest, a prime suspect, but never enough evidence. No arrest was ever made. And the investigation into Bob Crane's murder went cold. The case went unsolved for years. That is, until 1990, when a lone detective reopened Bob Crane's file. And in 1992, a suspect was in custody. Bob Crane's friend, well, more of a hanger-on, who fancied himself Bob Crane's manager, a man named John Henry Carpenter. Prosecutors claimed John Henry Carpenter beat Bob Crane to death with a camera tripod, which would have been eerily fitting, given the two and their past. You see, the two had a toxic dynamic, and when together, It was believed that they engaged in some sleazy, prurient behavior that involved women and video cameras. If you want to know more about that, there's a 2002 movie starring Greg Kinnear as Bob Crane and Willem Dafoe as John Henry Carpenter in a film by Paul Schrader called Autofocus. So why would someone who considered himself a friend, a colleague of Bob Crane, want to kill him? The motive, prosecutors believed, was envy, resentment, and fear. Bob Crane was trying to stage a Hollywood comeback, and his sordid friendship with the creepy Carpenter had become a liability. Now, this case went to trial in 1994, some 16 years after Bob Crane was found murdered. And at this time, the use of DNA as evidence to prove or disprove a case was pretty novel. And in the case of Bob Crane, it didn't solve his murder, but it did help exonerate his so-called friend, John Henry Carpenter. DNA testing on blood evidence found in John Carpenter's rental car, the blood that they believed belonged to Bob Crane, it didn't. Well, more accurately, the results were inconclusive. And ultimately, Carpenter, he was acquitted in that murder trial. Carpenter always maintained his innocence up until his death 4 years later in 1998. And the murder of Bob Crane remains unsolved, even all of these years later. But two things that were successful from that trial in 1994 was the broader use and wider acceptance of relatively new DNA technology as reliable in a criminal case. And the second thing, unfortunately for the image of actor Bob Crane, was the revelation that people are not what they seem, that those who present themselves to the world as squeaky clean too often have a dark and dirty side. That here was an actor, the star of Hogan's Heroes, someone everyone thought they knew. That image didn't match reality. A Hogan's hero who was, in fact, a Jekyll and Hyde, who managed to keep his perverse proclivities a secret from the whole world. And back at this elementary school, one could say the same thing about whoever this was, sending JoAnne these letters and doing these horrific acts. Because everyone in the school, they seemed normal. But one among them had a sick and twisted side. That Colonel Klink reference in the letter would prove to be a vital clue in cracking the harassment campaign against JoAnne Chambers. By 1994, all of the faculty at this school knew there was someone among them who was JoAnne's stalker. And everyone was on high alert. The edgy feeling of paranoia and suspicion as grating as nails on a chalkboard. And suddenly the small everyday things took on overwhelming significance. One day at school, someone overheard someone else compare the school superintendent to Colonel Klink. This someone had made a joke about how the school superintendent was just like the arrogant, incompetent, bungling Nazi commandant. And maybe in the past this would have played as a joke among comrades, but not here and not now. And soon someone went to the school superintendent and narked. And there had to be a connection between the person who made that comment in the teacher's lounge and the person who made that comment in those letters to JoAnne. And the person that made that comment, it was a teacher named Paula Naraki. Paula and JoAnne shared some curious things in common. Paula was also a veteran teacher, around the same age as JoAnne, and had worked in the school district for 18 years. It just so happened that she, too, taught the first grade, just like JoAnne. But otherwise, as people and as professionals, these two women, JoAnne and Paula, couldn't have been more different. Paula was a traditionalist. She was strict and disciplined by the book. She was also deeply respected. Someone said about Paula that she was as clean as a new chalkboard, and some might say about as stiff. Paula's comportment was not relaxed and fun. Where JoAnne wore her jeans and Mickey Mouse t-shirts, Paula wore her proper pearls and Laura Ashley-style prairie dresses. And one got the sense that she didn't necessarily approve of JoAnne trying to be best buddies with her students. Teaching the first grade wasn't some popularity contest. Or was it? Could it be the prim and proper Paula was envious of the more free-spirited and more beloved JoAnne? The superintendent and others overseeing the investigation sure thought so. Paula was brought in for questioning. When Paula was asked if she had anything to do with sending JoAnne some letters, she quickly denied it. She said, point blank, she had nothing to do with it. And she believed it had to be somebody from outside the school. No one she knew would do this. But after speaking with various other teachers at the school, authorities believed Paula knew more than she was letting on. And they were suspicious enough of Paula that they even asked JoAnne to secretly tape record a conversation with Paula to see if JoAnne could coax anything out of her. Any hint that she was the stalker. But when JoAnne brought up the subject of her stalker, everything Paula said was encouraging. She said she felt sorry for JoAnne and plainly stated she had no idea who was behind this. And there was something else Paula didn't know anything about. That hidden camera that was placed above JoAnne's desk in her classroom. The one police put there, hoping to catch JoAnne's sick stalker in the act. April 22nd, 1994, 12:40 p.m. Someone entered JoAnne's classroom, alone. It was a woman with short brown hair, a white turtleneck, and dark trousers. As this hidden camera tracked her every step, she walked directly over to her desk and, smooth as can be, picked up JoAnne's coffee cup. It was only a few seconds, then she turned around and left the classroom, mug in hand. In one of the letters, the person had made a reference to possibly poisoning JoAnne's coffee. And now, here was someone swiping JoAnne's coffee cup. This was the most compelling evidence they had yet, nearly busting someone in the act. The video was grainy and black and white, but they could make out the woman's face. Paula Naraki. Now, they didn't have Paula on tape doing much more than picking up a coffee cup, but rumors about her began to spread, and with that, suspicions around Paula Naraki swirled. And people noticed Paula seemed agitated and twitchy. When you thought about it, it made perfect sense. The straight-laced and subdued Paula Naraki was clearly envious of the bright and vivacious JoAnne Chambers. But what was shocking was how Paula had led this double life. She was a no-nonsense straight arrow in the classroom, all while secretly seething and scheming against her rival, JoAnne. When Paula was confronted, she tried to deny she was behind this. She even had an explanation for the classroom. JoAnne's classroom, in that coffee cup, she and JoAnne were in the classroom together a few minutes earlier, and they left the classroom together. And after they left, it was JoAnne who asked Paula if she wouldn't mind going back in and grabbing her cup. And of course, Paula agreed and said fine. So there'd been some mistake. She was innocent. Check the tape. Which authorities did. And true to what Paula said, the women were there together, chatting. Then the two left together. And it was Paula who returned alone and grabbed that coffee cup. JoAnne said she had no memory of telling Paula to go back to get the cup. So now it was JoAnne's word against Paula's word. And one of them had to be lying. Police officers wanted to do their due diligence. JoAnne had made some outrageous claims, and they didn't have enough evidence to back up those claims, not yet. So they asked JoAnne if she wouldn't mind taking a lie detector test. And of course, she readily agreed. Happily. When Paula heard about JoAnne taking a polygraph, she too boldly volunteered, insisting this test would clear her name. So one day, in 1994, each woman sat for the polygraph test. The alleged victim and her alleged stalker. And the two women were asked nearly identical questions. And the most significant question was this: did you have anything to do with the harassing letters to JoAnne Chambers? Both women said no. And after the test was over, one of them passed and the other one failed. So now they had their answer. One woman truthful, the other deceptive. This entire time, police believed that it was Paula who was behind this vicious harassment campaign. And the polygraph test? It proved they were right. He was of the opinion of the polygraph expert that JoAnne was telling the truth and Paula was lying. If Paula thought this lie detector test was going to prove her innocence, her whole scheme had backfired. Now, even back then, polygraph tests weren't anything you could use in court. But this polygraph test, along with some circumstantial evidence that pointed to Paula, including the Colonel Klink reference and that videotape, along with some self-incriminating comments, including almost daring the superintendent to try and prove that she did it. Add it all up, and police believed they had reasonable suspicion that Paula Naraki was behind the stalking and harassment of JoAnne Chambers. And with that suspicion, they went to Paula Naraki's house that she shared with her husband and asked if they could do a search. Paula agreed to the search. Why not? She said she had nothing to hide. And when they searched the house, they seized 3 key things: an old-fashioned typewriter, the one that people still used in the 90s, every piece of paper in her house, along with envelopes. The logic was, if they could tie Paula's typewriter, paper, and envelopes to those harassing letters, then they had their case. When they tested the typewriter, the envelopes, and the paper, It was not a match for those harassing letters. But there was no doubt in the authorities' minds that it was Paula who was harassing JoAnne, and a lot of people in the community felt the same way. And there were instances of parents calling the principal and asking for their children to be removed from Paula's classes. And JoAnne, she would have to be moved too. The situation was untenable. JoAnne was transferred to a different school in the fall of 1994, with the hope that this fixation on JoAnne Chambers would end. Out of sight, out of mind. A new school, new faces, a clean slate, a fresh start. JoAnne no doubt hoped, even for a brief moment, to feel safe and to feel free, to feel at peace. It was a blissful sensation JoAnne would want to savor, because it wouldn't last. The box was wrapped in pink. It looked like a gift you would give a 6-year-old on her birthday. But the pink box, it was meant for JoAnne. It was left for her outside of her new school. And when JoAnne opened the box, there was indeed a surprise inside. Not a gift, but a death wish. Inside the box was a disfigured Barbie doll. It looked more like a voodoo doll. This Barbie doll had its hair cut into a blonde bob, just like JoAnne. And the doll was dressed exactly like JoAnne's fun and playful style. Only this Barbie had one accessory. It was a razor blade jammed into the plastic doll's neck. And painted on that razor blade were small blobs of red paint meant to look like blood. And with that, one final note, the words, "You die," printed on paper with a picture of JoAnne with red marks on her face. This was it. Nowhere was safe. She lived every day thinking it was possible it could be her last. JoAnne later recounted this on camera for Forensic Files. JoAnne's big blue-green eyes wide and intense with fear, recounting the memory. JoAnne's grim prediction of her own doom, it was soon realized. November 1994. A day that JoAnne swore she would never forget. When a car roared up behind her, trying to run her off the road. She recalled looking in the rearview mirror, and she swore she'd never forget that face. The grim, determined face of someone who wanted JoAnne to die. After JoAnne was pushed over to the side of the road, Paula apparently zoomed off. And that's when JoAnne called the police. After over a year of intense investigation and the torture of JoAnne Chambers, Paula was arrested and charged with harassment, stalking, simple and aggravated assault, making terroristic threats, and recklessly endangering the life of JoAnne Chambers. Over 100 counts in all. And finally, after Paula's arrest, silence. The letters, the threats, the chaos finally stopped. At last, JoAnne Chambers could relax. She was safe. for now. January 1995. That winter in the Pocono Mountains was unusually mild. Very little snow, but life for Paula Naraki, it was cold, and it was bitter. Once a respected schoolteacher, Paula was now an accused criminal buried in an avalanche of shocking allegations. Paula was in over her head so deep, no one could tunnel her out. And she couldn't help but notice, bitterly, no one offered to try. 18 years in this school district. All of it undone in, 18 months? That was the duration of the hateful campaign lodged against JoAnne Chambers. Innocent until proven guilty. Paula always thought that was how the system worked. But she realized it was the reverse. Guilty until proven innocent. Because she was suspended from her teaching position. At least it was with pay. And that was good because she would need all the money she could get. This case was going to trial, and she could spend years in prison. She not only needed an attorney, she needed a private investigator. One who could find out what really happened, who was behind this. Because Paula knew it wasn't enough to prove her innocence. She was going to have to find out who really did it. And it sounded unhinged, but there was no other explanation. There was only one other person who could have done this. Paula believed it had to be JoAnne Chambers. Stalking herself, harassing herself, terrorizing herself. But think about what that meant. It meant JoAnne writing over 40 letters to herself. It meant JoAnne cutting out pictures of herself and pasting them on pornographic images, Xeroxing them and sending them to people and posting them all over the town. It meant JoAnne taking the time to mutilate a Barbie in her own grotesque image, putting a razor blade in a doll's throat and simulating blood with paint. And then there were the vile things she had to perform, including, shudder to think, the possibility that she defecated in her own chair. How else to explain how the smears of what was on JoAnne's chair, what was on JoAnne's skirt, how did that get there? Unless it was JoAnne herself. And then there was the greatest mystery of all. Why? Why had JoAnne done this if she had done this? And why had she tried to pin it all on Paula? What had Paula done to JoAnne? She had no idea, but she was going to have to find out. And she was going to have to find a way to prove it. And it wasn't going to be easy. The investigator she hired, he was an ex-cop, and even he admitted he too suspected Paula was guilty because the complaint against her was overwhelming, a laundry list of charges. But he was willing to give Paula the benefit of the doubt and see what he could find on JoAnne Chambers, who was widely believed to have an impeccable reputation. Though as he did a little digging, he discovered that wasn't quite true. He learned JoAnne Chambers was a serial victim when police from another town told this investigator that JoAnne Chambers was known for reporting strange incidences, from burglaries that didn't happen to fires that didn't exist. This investigator, his name was Jim Anderson. He told Forensic Files that every crime JoAnne was attached to had some weirdness to it. But it got even weirder. Previous colleagues at one of JoAnne's former schools revealed to this investigator that when she taught at their school, she also claimed she was being harassed. And that harassment included alleging someone had broken into her classroom and leaving a certain gift for her on her chair. They hadn't found this culprit behind that incident. They just had to take JoAnne's word for it, that there was a serial pooper who had it out for JoAnne. Over time, they realized that JoAnne had a flair for drama, and she often told wild stories that were too strange to be true. This was all very helpful information, but it was also a warning sign. If JoAnne was a pathological liar, she'd keep lying, and it was unlikely she'd ever confess. And she might even perjure herself in court if she had to. She also had everyone in this town in her corner. The police chief, the school superintendent, the prosecutors handling the case, anybody who had the power to call this off, they all believed Paula was guilty and JoAnne was innocent. Paula the perpetrator, JoAnne the victim. Paula's defense team would need more than character witnesses. They would need hard evidence, physical proof that it was JoAnne. And well, this being Forensic Files, this case would, of course, come down to forensic evidence. At some point, the local police department teamed up with the FBI. And as Paula, her attorney, and this investigator, Jim, prepared for her trial, they learned that the FBI had done some fingerprint analysis on the letters sent to JoAnne. But the fingerprints didn't match Paula's, which was good, but not enough. Paula's team asked if they could have these letters analyzed to see if these letters had traces of DNA. The court agreed to allow the letters to be tested, with two conditions. The first was the cost of that DNA testing, which was back then a whopping $7,000. Paula would have to pay for that herself. The second condition, the results of the DNA analysis had to be disclosed with everyone, including the prosecutors. This meant if by some chance Paula's DNA was found anywhere on these letters, the envelopes, the stamps, her attorney would have to submit that evidence to the court, which would mean she was done for. She might as well confess because she was going to prison. And she'd likely get the maximum sentence of 5 years, lose her teaching certificate, and she'd never enter a first-grade classroom or any classroom as an educator ever again. Paula said she was willing to take the risk, and she'd find the money. Paula's attorneys sent blood samples, both Paula and her husband's, along with samples of those harassing letters, including the outside envelopes, to a local lab where they were reviewed by a forensic scientist, Dr. Diane Lichtenwaller. And now here's the part we've all been waiting for. The signature sleepy part of Forensic Files. First, scientists used steam to gently remove the 3 stamps used to send the letter. The stamps were swabbed for epithelial cells. Those are cells that come from saliva. Next, the envelope flaps were swabbed for more epithelial cells, saliva from licking the envelope. DNA was indeed found on one set of stamps and one envelope. But there was a problem. They needed to generate more cells. And they needed more cells to sufficiently determine an accurate result. So they turned to a process called PCR, which is short for polymerase chain reaction. As you'll recall, we learned a lot about PCR in a previous episode of Dead Sleep called Chain Reaction. Now, at the time of Paula's trial, PCR was a cutting-edge genetic science. Just 2 years earlier, in 1993, a geneticist named Kary Mullis received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his pioneering of a way to multiply DNA cells. And this forensic advancement would help solve scores of cold cases no one thought possible to solve because there was too little DNA or degraded DNA. Murder cases, missing persons, and now, here in 1995, a small town stalking case that was now all over the news. Thanks to the use of PCR, the lab was able to determine the DNA cells found on the back of the stamps and the flap of an envelope didn't match the epithelial cells of Paula Naraki nor her husband, which proved, without a doubt, Paula was innocent. But of course, Paula knew being innocent wasn't enough. She had to also find the perpetrator, and she had to prove who was really guilty. She had to prove it was JoAnne Chambers. Paula Naraki lived her whole life as someone who did everything by the book. She was the teacher who was as clean as a new chalkboard. But now, if she wanted to save herself, she was going to have to fight dirty. It was a risky move in a small town, especially when you're accused of criminally stalking someone, to go to that person's house without their knowledge and take their trash. But Paula's investigator, Jim Anderson, assured her this was legal. Once a trash bin is placed on the curbside, the owner gives up all rights to the contents inside. It was gross stuff, but what Jim was looking for was anything with JoAnne's biological material, mucus, saliva, earwax. And while digging, they found a used piece of tissue, a plastic drinking straw, and a used cotton swab. And they sent it all back to the lab for Diane Lichtenwaller to review. And after a series of genetic tests, this time, the genotypes, they all matched. When this DNA evidence was presented to the prosecution, as promised, Paula and her attorney were in for a shock. The prosecution, for reasons that aren't quite clear, were determined to move forward. There would still be a trial. And in November of 1995, Paula Naraki went on trial for these multiple counts against her in the harassment and stalking of JoAnne Chambers. The trial spanned 5 days. And it was worrisome from that very first day how much public sympathy was with JoAnne as she recounted what happened to her. And her emotion, her expressive eyes, immediately put the jury on her side. That poor woman. Also on JoAnne's side were some of the most powerful members of the community, including the chief of police, the superintendent, all of whom declared Paula guilty, not only in court, but in media interviews for the world to see. But by the end of the week, things changed. The irrefutable evidence, the forensic evidence that supported Paula's innocence was obvious. And so it now seemed was JoAnne Chambers' guilt. At one point, JoAnne Chambers agreed to give a blood sample of her own to double-check those DNA results. Maybe because she'd aced the polygraph, why not the DNA test? But this time, it was JoAnne who failed this test. It was scientific fact. The saliva on the envelopes and stamps matched JoAnne's DNA. When JoAnne took the stand, however, she attempted to offer an explanation. And the explanations were silly and implausible. And by the end of the trial, sympathies shifted from JoAnne to Paula. This included the jury, who decided Paula Naraki was not guilty. And afterwards, jurors rallied around Paula. Perfect strangers hugged her and told her they loved her, and they expressed how sorry they were that all this happened. But there were others who were not sorry. The chief of police, who said he was just doing his job. The superintendent, who said he was just doing his job. And JoAnne Chambers, who swore she was innocent. She had nothing to do with it, despite all of the evidence, the forensic evidence, to the contrary. Now it was Paula who wanted justice, and it would be a long and expensive road. Her legal bills for this case alone were over $100,000. But she would fight on, eventually filing several lawsuits against the police, against JoAnne Chambers. Over the next several years, even into the 2000s, Paula would wage legal battles. This did include a $25,000 payout from JoAnne Chambers, but no admission of guilt. JoAnne Chambers was never charged with any crime, and both women went back to teaching at the same district, but at different schools. After everything Paula went through, she realized the hard way how much she valued her privacy. And if you do a half-decent internet search, there's virtually nothing out there beyond the media attention from the 1990s. And it seems she largely enjoys a quiet life, the one she desired. As for JoAnne, if all of this is true, we'll never know why she did it. JoAnne Chambers passed away in November of 2024 at the age of 76. But if she did indeed stalk herself to generate attention, well, JoAnne got it. Just not in the way she might have envisioned. Over the past 30 or so years, this episode of Forensic Files has been watched millions of times and will likely be watched millions of more times in perpetuity. And even after all of these years, in 399 other episodes, watching JoAnne Chambers, with a chilling self-possession, swear she could not have done this. It's an eerie performance, one that still tops the list of the most mysterious and bizarre Forensic Files episodes ever. Okay, maybe not number 1, but definitely number 2. Thank you so much for joining me for this special Dead Sleep rendition of Forensic Files. I will be back next week with the September bonus episode. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Until then, nighty-night.